Hello, I'm Caroline Robinson, and I'm here today to talk to you about red mite in chickens and then to give a bird flu update for winter 2020 now that we have a bit more information. I work for Scotland's Rural College. A lot of you will have heard of us due to our educational qualifications as skills-based courses, but we also do have consultancy branches. So that would be SAC Consulting, where our agricultural and rural business consultants work, and SRUC Vets, which is who I work for. You can usually find us at festivals every year, obviously not this year, but generally we'll have a stand, very, very happy to give out advice on particular management problems that you might be having, or if you want any information on particular diseases, and also really, really keen to hear from you about how things are going for you on your small holding, any of the problems that you might be coming across. So moving on to red mite in chickens now, one of the most important things to be confident with to spot problems is just the overall appearance of whether or not your chicken might be at risk of red mite. Now, one of the most common signs that you can sometimes find with red mite is anemia. They are blood feeders. So, for example, top left there, we've got a red comb. It's a large red comb. That one's particularly vivid. However, you know, most of the time they're a slightly duller kind of red. But that would be within normal limits for a chicken. On the top right, we have a large comb which is pale. Now that could be a sign of anemia. So there could be a problem with red mite for that chicken, or perhaps worms. Bottom left, we've got a chicken that is not yet in lay. So if you buy your chickens at the point of lay and they haven't matured fully yet, they haven't started laying, they'll usually have a very small comb which is pale. Now that's normal, so don't worry about that. And I've added at the bottom a blue comb just to differentiate. If I saw one chicken with a blue comb, I would be thinking of an individual disease for that chicken. Whereas if I saw a couple of chickens with a pale comb, like the one on the top right, I would really be worrying about a group problem like red mites or worms. Housing is important if you're just setting up because it can make a difference in how you manage to deal with red mite. There are a lot of different types on the market. You may have heard that roofing felt is not a great idea for red mite, which is true. If you have a layer of roofing felt over a layer of wood for the roof, then you've just created a lovely space in between the two that your disinfectant and treatments cannot reach, that the red mites can sit warm and snug whilst you're trying to get rid of them and really be unaffected by any of these treatments. So it can definitely make a difference. Also, you'll come across the newer plastic models of houses on the market, not one particular brand. There are lots of brands of plastic houses. They can be easier to clean. Just make sure that when you're looking at them that they're easily taken apart, and that any bits that are not easily taken apart don't contain any obvious gaps or crevices that could make a really handy hidey hole for red mite if you're trying to disinfect the various pieces. So just to go through them, top coop there, the dark brown one has a plastic roof for the nest boxes, and it has an onduline roof for the rest of the coop, which is a corrugated substance that's quite easily cleaned. That's the type of coop that I have. I personally do have a wooden coop. It does definitely have crevices in between the various lats of wood, which make it a bit easier a bit harder to clean. But you know, if it's easily taken apart with a screwdriver, you can find that that wooden coops can be practical options. In the middle, we've got one on the left that has the roofing felt, but as you can see, it can also be taken apart. I would still say that that poses a greater risk. Although there are various features there to make it a bit more easily cleaned, you do have that large area of roof felt that mites can hide under. On the right in the middle, you can see that the roof is overlapping pieces of wood. Now, depending on the size of those overlaps and gaps, you might find that it is not possible to get your disinfectant or treatment into those gaps. So I would say that that would bear further examination before you made a decision on that coop. The bottom left, you can see that the nest box roof is unduline, that corrugated substance that I was talking about, but they have the roofing felt on the top. So that would generally be a little bit harder to eradicate red mite from. And on the bottom right, you will see that there is an example of a plastic house. As I say, there are various different types and brands available, and you just want to make sure that if they are advertising as easily cleaned, then they are easily taken apart without any crevices left behind that the red mite can hide in. How your hens interact with their environment is going to affect how likely they are to be affected by red mite. Having a run is a good way to prevent contact with wild birds that could bring in red mite, but you do need to make sure you have enough space in the run for all your hens to be comfortable and to move around, and be aware that that will probably involve moving the run in the house around your ground or your garden as the run starts to get quite scraped up and sometimes puddly and waterlogged and so on. You tend to want to move them around to fresh grass, which adds a little bit of labour. Versus free-range hens, which do then have contact with the wild birds. Unfortunately, it's a bit less labour, obviously, but for example, bottom left there is a picture of my hens sitting right beside an area which is particularly dusty that I know the wild birds absolutely love to dust bath in, and so do the chickens. So there's a point of contact there. Also, you can sometimes use dust baths as one of your methods of treatment. So if they're all able to go out and create their own dust baths under any old tree, sometimes that can curtail the efficacy of that treatment. And depends on how free range they are, really. Ours sometimes are in and out, so they have the opportunity to be exposed only to the dust bath in the run, and then sometimes they get a chance to trundle out and about the garden, depending. Some people who are new chicken keepers are concerned when they see their birds go through a molt, thinking that it might be mites. Experienced keepers will know that hens tend to go through a molt once a year, usually in the autumn. Egg laying goes down or stops altogether, which is sometimes one of the signs of red mite. The feathers tend to start to go a bit scruffy before they fall out, which again can sometimes be a sign. So just be aware, molting is a normal thing that does happen for chickens as well, if you haven't come across it. It can sometimes be very subtle, as in a few feathers getting loose at a time, as with this picture, or you can see why new chicken keepers can sometimes be forgiven for wondering whether or not their chicken has developed some kind of parasitic skin disease. This girl tends to chuck all of her feathers at once, although she normally looks like that. And you can see the unduline roof on the chicken coop quite well there. That coop does come apart relatively well, but as I say, it is probably a bit more labour intensive to scrub and disinfect than some of the plastic models might be. Red mites tend to live in the coop most of the time, not on the birds. That's one of the reasons it's so difficult to treat. They like to live in the cracks of houses, under perches, under roofing felt, and in the corners of nest boxes, and they come out and feed in the birds at night when they go to bed in the coop. They can live a long time without feeding, so if you've had a gap and you think your chicken coop couldn't possibly have any leftover mites from the last lot of chickens, I'm afraid sometimes it really can. And during hot conditions, they can increase their numbers very, very fast. They have a very short life cycle, just a week long in the best conditions sometimes. They can bite people, but they don't live on people. There is another type of mite you might come across, which is called a northern fowl mite, and it lives on birds. They only survive for a few weeks off the birds, so they're easier sometimes to control, but they are also a bloodsucker. So be aware there are different types of mites that you can get confused with. Wild birds can bring both in. Clinical signs, which is the word for symptoms in birds, they could be lethargic, they could be fluffed up, they could have a pale comb like we showed you, egg drop, which is a reduction in the number of eggs they're laying, perhaps with pale yolks. Sometimes they're really reluctant to go to bed at night because they know they're going to get itchy and sore. Sometimes they're weak, and in the worst cases, I'm afraid you can see deaths. You may see blood spots on the eggs, and because they bite people, you sometimes find that you can get very itchy when you're cleaning the coop. Feathers around the back end can become blackened with dried blood. But the best way to check for them, because they live in the coop, is if you go out at night with a piece of paper towel and a torch, and you use that piece of paper towel to swipe under the perches and stuff into the corners of the nest boxes, and then you check the paper towel. If you see blood spots on the paper towel, that means that there's mites out and about in that coop that night. Because you've just basically got some squashed mites on your paper towel. So that's a good way to check for them quite early. With big infestations, you sometimes see them in the corner of nest boxes anyway, or you'll see a really grey ashy deposit with a few mites in it. But early on, that's one of the best ways to check for them. Northern fowl mites you can see on the feathers, sometimes under the wing or around the vent while the chickens are out and about. And red mites look like this. So you can find them in the coop at night, or occasionally, if you have lost a chicken, unfortunately, you sometimes find them on dead birds in the coop, if there's a dead chicken in the coop. Don't panic if you see one of these guys. This is a red spider mite, and he's vegetarian. You quite often see them in your garden. They're everywhere in the garden once you start looking for them. It looks like a tiny bright orange spider with long spidery legs. So you can see there is a bit of a difference there between these dark red shiny beans, which are only the size of a head of a pin, really. They're very, very small, versus this guy who is also very small, but he's bright orange. He's got very obvious legs, and he's probably crawling about on a fence or a wall or a tree or some kind of vegetation in your garden. That quite often sets people off in a panic, thinking that they're red mites. But there is a bit of a difference if you can look closely, and one of them is no bother at all. Treatment and prevention. So ideally, make sure you don't buy any of these red mites in on new chickens. Make sure you treat them and keep them separate from your other chickens for hopefully maybe a week or so before you pop them in together. You want to treat them a couple of times a week apart. We tend to do ours by puffering under the wings and on the vent and all through the feathers with diatomaceous earth, and then leave them with a dust bath that has diatomaceous earth in it, and then introduce them. If you find that you do have red mites on the chickens, if you've actually seen, for instance, northern fowl mite, or you're a bit suspicious that you've seen a couple of red mite on the chicken, then you can get a slightly stronger treatment. Have a wee talk to your vet about that when you're buying in chickens. If you find that you do have them in your coop, you're really going to have to go for a very thorough wet cleaning. You're going to have to remove any organic debris, because disinfectants don't work well if there's any sort of dirty organic debris in your coop. Give it a good clean. Then use a chemical disinfectant specifically for red mite. It will say on it. And if you're wondering what treatments to use, have a look at the label. If there is something that's slightly waffling on about deterring mites or repelling mites, that isn't telling you that they're killing mites. That is just kind of giving you an idea that might be handy maybe to persuade mites that it's not a great place to live. That's not the kind of vagueness that you want. If you have mites, you want something that kills those mites, because they are very dangerous. So you want there's so many different products that you will come across an awful lot of different ones, but that is a good way to tell the difference. By all means, if you're really keen on some of the ones that are just mite repellent or deterrent or whatever, if you don't have mites and you're treating your house once a month or something to try and keep them at bay, then that's perfectly acceptable. But if you know you have mites, you want something that kills the mites. Diatomaceous earth is quite a handy thing to have around, both for treatment and for prevention. So for prevention, I tend to put it in my dust bath. I also sometimes use it in the bedding if it's a particularly high risk time of year. We use it to treat the chickens when they come in, if we've bought in new chickens, and you can use it as part of the treatment. So for example, I have had red mite before in my chickens. We caught it extremely early. None of the chickens were sick. So I used diatomaceous earth and red mite specific disinfectants, a couple of treatments a week apart, It's when you're treating your chickens in your house, you want to do them all at the same time, and you want to make sure you do at least 2 treatments 5 to 7 days apart. You sometimes do have to do a third one. So just be aware of that. If, however, my chickens had been sick with red mite, I would have gone straight for a stronger treatment. I don't have time to waste sort of getting most of them one week and then trying to mop up the rest the next week. I would have spoken to somebody about getting some specific red mite treatment, probably ivermectin drops from the pharmacy. So you can get them from veterinary pharmacies. You can get them by speaking to your vet. There is a website online called chickenvet.co.uk that is run specifically by poultry-friendly vets, and it actually has a great advice page telling you everything you would need to know about red mite. It has a shop as well. I'm not affiliated with these people, and there are lots of products available from lots of different sources, but especially for their advice page, I would say it's well worth a visit if you're worried. Some of the disinfectants or house treatments like Dergal or Intercocask specify that they are useful in cases of red mite, and they can kill red mites and limit red mite infestations. Steam cleaning, if you happen to have a steam cleaner, that can sometimes help. House design, we've talked about. Veterinary consult, if they're no better quickly. As I say, I use diatomaceous earth and good disinfection, and then more diatomaceous earth, both on the chickens, in the bedding and in the dust bath to control my small outbreak. But if it had been any worse, I would have gone straight to an ivermectin or similar treatment, and the way to access that would be through a vet or a veterinary website. So we will need at least one repeat treatment. So you're looking at least sort of 2 weeks worth of treating and scrubbing and so on, and there could be a third treatment at the end of that gap as well. Just to let you know, there are other types of mites. So scaly leg is a type of mite as well, and it quite often has a very similar treatment. Not the diatomaceous earth, but the disinfectants like Dergal that are used for killing mites, and sometimes ivermectin drops through your vet. Now, just moving on to a very 2020 specific update on bird flu. If you have any kind of poultry, then you will be concerned about whether or not we have bird flu. The reason that we are usually concerned about bird flu at this time of year is that we are more at risk of outbreaks in the winter due to the migratory patterns of waterfowl. This is a diagram of migratory patterns, and you can see they can travel vast distances. Now, every year, the government and governments of various countries across the world will be looking to see if there are outbreaks of avian flu on these pathways. Certain times in the past, we have found that outbreaks in particular parts of the world have then been followed fairly reliably by outbreaks in the UK because of the location of the initial outbreaks being connected on a migratory pathway to the north of Europe. This has happened this year in terms of there are outbreaks in the sort of early warning areas that have in the past then been followed by outbreaks in the UK. So while it's definitely not a guarantee that we would get bird flu this year, that's not what we're saying. We are saying that we're at a slightly higher risk this year. We are definitely a bit more confident that there may be a bird flu outbreak this year, just because the same pattern of outbreaks in the past has always been followed in previous years by outbreaks in the UK. It's just a virus. It's a flu virus like human flu or swine flu, or bird flu is the colloquial term for avian influenza. It's what we call notifiable, which means if you suspect you have it in your poultry, you must speak to your vet. You must notify your vet, who will then notify the APHA. It can be carried by wild birds. You can spread it into buildings on objects. It can affect any size of flock. If you are concerned about finding out more as to what all the naming and so on tends to mean, strains are named for the H and N proteins on their surface. So you'll hear things like H5N8 or H6N1. That's just a way to determine different strains of flu, and they have different behaviour. So for example, some strains are what we call highly pathogenic, which means highly disease-causing. They are more serious, and you might see swollen heads, you might see a big drop in eating, you might see a lot of respiratory signs and diarrhea and an obvious drop in eggs and maybe deaths in birds. So, don't worry about bird flu and worry about whether or not you'd have serious high pathogenic bird flu, because you would know. It would be, in most cases, fairly obvious. And we always want you to be prepared, but not worried. It's all about just being focused on the prevention and keeping everybody safe. And the only thing that we would say is that if you're a keeper of ducks or geese, it can be less obvious in those types of birds. There is a type of flu that is called low pathogenic, and when we have outbreaks of that type of bird flu, we don't tend to see the big housing orders and major kind of action taken. It is much less disease causing. It's still notifiable, but we're talking mild breathing problems, sometimes a bit of diarrhea. So it's a bit less of a sort of instant action when a local premises near you has low pathogenic, low disease-causing flu. Spreads bird to bird in body fluids or feces. It's not airborne over large distances, but it can ride on contaminated clothing or equipment, or if you're walking around sort of wild birds outside and then track that into your house, into your chicken house. You'll have either experienced this or may just remember this before you got your own poultry, but when there is a big bird flu outbreak of high pathogenic bird flu, it can result in an immediate compulsory housing order for chickens, turkeys and ducks. Now that's why we're here today, is just to say this year we're worried this might happen. It's slightly more likely to be happening than some years previously. We want you all to be thinking, what would I do if tomorrow I was told I had to house all of my poultry? If that's completely impractical, they do ask for complete separation from contact with wild birds instead. That means also separation from contact with feces of wild birds. So for example, situating your coop under a whole bunch of trees where there's going to be a lot of bird dropping happening, that's less practical. With geese, game birds and other birds, you just have to take practical steps to keep them separate from wild birds. And they usually do ask in those situations that you keep the types separate. So poultry like chickens and turkeys, keep them separate from geese and ducks that are less likely to show symptoms if they get the bird flu. So if you do have your chickens and ducks in a big paddock together or something like that, then you may find that not only do you have to house them, but you have to make sure and keep them separate under the terms of the prevention zone requirements. There's a detailed handout available. I'll try to put this link up on our virtual stand. And there's also a fact sheet summary available, both on government websites, but you can go to the government websites and put avian influenza in the search box, and hopefully some of this will come up. What does it mean for you? Right now, you need to consider how you would house, or if really impractical, otherwise keep separate your poultry from wild birds and in some cases from each other. It is a bit of a stress, and also for the birds, it can involve a bit of stress being moved. So you want to do it as seamlessly as possible. Sheds, garage, covered runs, they've all been used. Polytunnels have been used just as temporary housing. In terms of biosecurity, sometimes that just means having a boot dip full of disinfectant in front of these runs before you go into them, so you're not tracking sort of disease from wild bird feces in the yard into your chickens. and just generally being aware that you don't want any contaminated equipment or contaminated little visitors or anything like that going in among your chickens when they could have tracked through some wild bird feces. Some of the disinfectants are definitely approved for use against viruses, so you know that they're going to work. Think about if you have big poultry operations and it's likely that you're going to be using vehicles to get around certain areas, think about your wheels and how you store your bedding, whether or not wild birds are roosting in that, where your food and water are stored. Make sure your food and water supply aren't accessible to wild birds while it's in with the chickens. And just, as we say, make everything as secure as you possibly can. Where you can find updates as to whether or not we are going to be under a prevention zone housing order. Hopefully your vet would be aware. Scotland's Rural College, the Animal and Plant Health Agency are the ones who are responsible for accepting notifications that a notifiable disease such as bird flu has been found, so they'll be aware. Just general managemental questions you may be able to direct to the helpline for the Farm Advisory Service. The Scottish Government website will always have an update as to what's happening in Scotland. DEFRA down in England on the government website will generally have updates on both what is happening in England and the UK. It's the sort of overview UK website. You can also register your poultry flocks. You do have to if you've got 50 or more. But if you've got less than 50 poultry of any kind, you don't need to register, but you can register voluntarily. And what that means is that DEFRA is aware of where you are and can contact you quickly if there is a bird flu outbreak. So there's various different species that rule of 50 applies to. You can have mixed species and they all count together. And you can register voluntarily if you wish. So as we say, be prepared, not worried, and scrambling at the last minute. Just be aware we're at a slightly higher risk this year of outbreaks than some previous years. You may well be asked to house your chickens at fairly short notice. It might not happen, that would be great. But it's always worth just being aware of these things, especially if you're a fairly new chicken keeper and you haven't really had to go through that before yourself. Thank you very much for listening today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the talks.